All right, welcome back for another episode of The Unplanned Show. With me today, Paula Kennedy. Say hello, Paula.
Hello.
Thank you for tuning in and joining us. And thank you, Paula, because I know it's late UK time, so I appreciate you staying up and joining us. Before we get into it, we'll be talking to Paula about platform engineering, a topic that I admire, have admired Paula for a long time and her expertise in this area. Before we get into it, just to cover a few of the upcoming things happening around PagerDuty. We've got, and I'll drop some of these links into the chat. We have next week, we're going to be doing a demo roundup with Mandy and Taz. We're going to be focusing on change events. So one of those things that happens a lot is, when something goes wrong, one of the first questions is, well, what changed? And so there's kind of how do you pull that data together, and then take it to the next level as well. So that'll be a really fun one. And then actually just the next day, for folks who have been kind of following along, this is sort of actually a little bit related to the platform question, but we will be having a virtual meetup around the Backstage plugin for PagerDuty. So Tiago, who was on the Unplanned show back in October with Meg Watson, talking about the Backstage plugin for PagerDuty, just before the Spotify marketplace for Backstage launched last year. So yeah, if you are using the Backstage plugin, or you're using Backstage and didn't know about the plugin, want to learn about it, this is a great thing to tune into and be able to ask your questions and hear from other folks who are using it. And then last but not least, we have the PagerDuty on Tour roadshow coming to a city near you. So first up is New York City on May 22nd. You can find all of those links to any of the available registration sites. June 11th in San Francisco, and then heading your way, Paula, London on June 22nd. Then the tour will be swinging through the Asia Pacific Japan region a little later in the summer, going to Tokyo and Sydney. So stay tuned for those. But you can register for any of those three: the demo roundup, the virtual meetup for the Backstage plugin, or the PagerDuty on Tour shows at any of those links I just dropped in the chat. So with that, let's get on to the topic of the day. Platform engineering is something that's been talked about a lot in a lot of different, you're now even hearing Gartner talking about it more, which if Gartner's talking about it, it's probably been around for a few years. But that means that, more and more people are paying attention and catching on, and they're kind of looking for that guidance. And so, Paula, as someone who's kind of really been at the forefront of the platform as product movement and a lot of the things that really are, part of how to be successful with platform engineering, as well as the bits and bytes, like, how do you define it? How, like, if someone has to, like, hey, tell me what this means, how do you explain it to someone?
That's a it's a really good question, and it's also one of those ones that if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. So I feel like platform engineering, you're right, it's become a really popular term. It's kind of peak hype cycle right now. I think, like DevOps, it's one of those terms that people can use to mean different things and can twist it to suit whatever they kind of want it to mean, let's say. I think for me, platform engineering is it's actually not new, to your point. Like, the fact that you've got so many people talking about it now means it's actually been around for a long time. And I'd say platform engineering, the sort of the core of it, which is really just, offering some kind of internal platform. And it doesn't like technology agnostic, right? It doesn't matter what the platform is, offering something that enables your developers to be able to run their software on top of. Like, that's the kind of the very most basic definition of a platform. And a platform in one form or another has existed forever, right? If you've been deploying software to production, you've been running on a platform somewhere, even if you haven't called it a platform.
Mm-hmm.
I think platform engineering is now more of a coming together of practices, of people and organizations recognizing that there's more value to be had by having a central kind of platform, maybe even more than one platform or more than one platform team, but having a way of being able to bring together skills and being able to offer things to developers to give them a smoother developer experience.
So is that that point of a smoother developer experience, is that how you kind of measure, like, is this working? Are you on the right path with platform engineering? Is that the primary lens to evaluate?
I think that also classic consultant answer, it depends, but it's tied into what's the goals of your business, right? Your metrics or your KPIs or your OKRs, whatever you want to call your kind of measurements. Your internal platform team, whatever they're measuring, should be lined up with what the business cares about. So if the business cares about getting software shipped faster to customers, then the platform team's metrics should be about how to therefore enable developers to go faster.
Mhm.
If the business cares about uptime, having as few incidents as possible, then the platform team should be really measuring on availability of the platform. So there's different metrics that platform teams can apply. So when you think about what's a successful platform, it's
Mhm.
context specific, right? It's not one size fits all. But we do hear a lot about developer experience, similar to talk about platform engineering, right? People talk about DevX all the time.
Yeah.
And so if you have a nice developer experience, if it is easier for your developers, that is definitely a good measure of seeing that your platform is successful. But then when you ask the question, well, how do we measure that? That
Yeah.
comes that comes with its own problems, right? So it's like, is it like developer happiness? Is it time from kind of idea to production? Like, what are the things that you want to measure around developer experience? And again, context specific, depends what your developers care about. Talking to the developers is a really good start, though, I'd have to say.
Okay.
Understanding what their
Um,
pain is and asking them, that's a really good thing to do.
yeah. And like you've mentioned that this is something that's not really new. But what are you seeing that is new in terms of how people are approaching it, or things that have changed in this whole, in the kind of platform engineering world? Like, what is shaking things up?
I think the biggest pattern is one I feel like again, I've been talking about it for a long time, but I'm starting to see much more kind of resonance, which is the platform as a product that you mentioned at the beginning.
Mhm.
Right. So I saw a really great panel discussion last week, which Charity Majors was on. And one of the comments she made was platform engineering is not new. It's been around a long time. But the thing that's new is having a product mindset for folks who traditionally have been on infrastructure teams or have been sysadmins who've maybe not had to deliver features to an end customer or worked on an actual kind of customer facing product. And maybe they've never had to do user research or design or even think in those terms. And so platform as a product is kind of a buzzword in itself. But really what that boils down to is thinking about who's using your platform, what are their pains, and then how do you kind of meet those user needs and solve some of their problems. And that mindset switch is hard, right? I'm not going to say it's easy, but that's a change that we've seen and I think is becoming more and more popular, more understood, which doesn't necessarily mean everyone's being able to do it right now, but
Mhm.
it's understood as maybe that's a good thing to try.
Yeah. What seems to be some of the big barriers that folks run into? I mean, you already kind of alluded to one, which is that this is a mindset shift for folks who might be more on the infrastructure side, or sysadmins, and they don't have the background or maybe the skill set to do the type of user research and that kind of product thinking. um, but you know what, when you step back and see, like, what are the things that are really getting in people's ways, If the payoff is, hey, this is a way to align, how your dev teams are working with business goals, whether it's aligning them to velocity or aligning them to availability. This is an opportunity to get that alignment, but it's going to require a number of things, people, process, and technology. What seems to be the big thing in the way?
I think there's lots of things right now. I guess the pattern we're seeing across, our industry altogether right now is like times are tough, people don't have money, therefore investment is hard, and companies are having to place their chips where they think they can get the most value, right? And so in some, especially more traditional organizations, I think platform teams are seen as a cost center, right? They're not the team that's generating revenue. They're not customer facing. Therefore, people try to reduce spend on infrastructure, which might be tied to platform, and therefore platform teams can be underinvested in, underfunded. And when you're then trying to bring new skills into that team, so a strong recommendation I'd say to customers often is, bring in a product manager to the platform team. Well, that costs money, right? Or bring in a
Mhm.
designer, or do some user research. All of these things are seen as cost, and so trying to make the business case can be difficult, right? When organizations are focused on trying to do more with less right now,
Yeah.
it's hard. It's a hard sell to say, well, you will get this value, you will see the return on investment, but you have to invest now to get that return, and it won't be quick. It's not like put out a new feature, sell more products, right? The feedback cycle is quite long. So trying to improve your platform, even if you've got a big team and you're trying to really go as fast as possible, platform development, understanding needs, building the things that customer needs, getting feedback, all of that takes time. So I think straight up cost right now is challenging. I mentioned the kind of the mindset thing. I mean, the hardest thing is always people, if I'm
Right.
honest. It's always people. It's never the tech. So I think even when companies maybe they do have the funding and maybe they can bring in some people to kind of upskill the team, or bring in new people into a team, it's still difficult to change people's habits, change people's behaviors, bring in new processes. And I mentioned about kind of understanding user needs, right? One of the things that I always find interesting is when there's a strong recommendation with platform as a product to go talk to your users of your platform or your customers. You can only build what they want if you know what they want. But the act of going and talking to developers, the act of actually sitting down and getting feedback, that can make people feel uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you have an idea that maybe your platform is not quite performing or not quite meeting the needs. Are you going to walk over to someone's desk and say, hey, tell me about the platform, and then get a mouthful of information that maybe you're not quite ready to hear? So I think it's definitely the people part's always the hardest, but I think funding as well can be challenging right now.
Yeah. And you mentioned about recommending to bring in a manager where product managers are, if they've been doing it a while, they're pretty seasoned at the tough feedback, and they'll keep going back for more. But if you're not used to that, it can be a pretty uncomfortable, like, oh, I don't want to do that again, but it's actually what you need to do. Well, let's talk a little bit about, like, okay, the people's the hard part. The tech is usually in some ways the easiest part. But we were catching up a little while ago about what you've been up to at Syntasso and this whole idea of orchestration. And so I wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about that. And that sort of seems like something, also addressing a technology challenge that's kind of has been emerging. So tell us a little bit about how platform orchestration fits in.
Sure. I mean, there's a really great blog article that one of our team put out, Daniel Bryant. So I guess you probably know Daniel, but he put out a great blog article just recently about this. I think the way that we think about it is, and it's not new. Again, I feel like nothing's new. Maybe that's just because I'm old, but it's like if you think about once upon a time, we used to talk. You and I together used to talk about platform as a service quite a lot, right? In the PaaS, when PaaS was cool, we talked about that quite a lot. But we talked about kind of IaaS, and then PaaS and SaaS. So you kind of had these layers. We've been talking about this kind of like stratification for a long time anyway. So you've got like your infrastructure, then you've got your like platform, and then you've got your like software as a service or like your applications, like these different layers of the stack. And that's not new. I think what we've seen though in the last, or certainly for the last 10 years for me, right? My journey has been working in Pivotal, working on Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And we had a vision that, you know, developers wanted a nice experience. They wanted that CF push, like, here is my code, run it in the cloud for me. I don't care how, right? They wanted that experience. And Cloud Foundry was massively like successful. It had lots and lots of applications and workloads running on it, but it was a bit of a black box. Like people couldn't necessarily customize it the way they wanted. They couldn't have all the flexibility that they needed, but for like lots and lots of use cases, it was fantastic. And then we saw the rise of Kubernetes, right? So we've seen Kubernetes has come in, taken over, it's everywhere. And Kubernetes is a much lower level kind of type of technology. So it's much easier then for people to customize and they can do what they want and it's great and it's ultimate flexibility. But Kubernetes itself is not actually a platform. It's a kind of a much lower level kind of substrate. And therefore, when you're giving that to developers and you're saying, hey, have at it. Here's some Kubernetes. Go for your life. You can do anything you want now. We've just seen over time it's too much. Like there's so much evidence. We see the CNCF landscape. We see that there's like 1,000,001 tools out there. But to get yourself back to that kind of PaaS experience, that I'm just going to have a lovely developer experience. I'm going to run my software. It's going to run. I don't care about all the plumbing underneath. We've ended up in a situation where DevOps teams are having to build that themselves, right? We had a term at Syntastic which we call the platform gap, which is basically when you've got lots of teams and they're DevOps, so it's build it, you run it. What you've ended up with is each DevOps team having to build their own platform to then be able to build the software, to then be able to run the whole lot, and it's too much. It's just too much. So we've seen platform engineering emerge kind of in this to fill this vacuum. But it's really hard because people who are trying to build the platform, they're trying to offer this developer experience. They're trying to build their own Cloud Foundry or their own Heroku or their own kind of platform as a service experience. It's flipping hard. I mean, how many people did we have at Pivotal? We had thousands, right? We were pretty big once upon I mean, VMware even obviously bigger now, Broadcom even bigger now. But even at Pivotal, we had a lot of people whose day job was building the platform. All day, every day, that's what they built. And to ask companies to try and do that is difficult. So it's a very long-winded way of saying that is the challenge that we at Syntasso at least have seen emerge. And we've been, like my co-founders and I, we've been through this whole journey. Right? The three of us came through from Pivotal and we saw the rise of Kubernetes and we were heavily involved with Tanzu and some of the Kubernetes-based stuff that Tanzu was doing. And then we've formed Syntasso to basically try to solve the same thing of how do we make it easy to have a platform that gives developers the good experience, but is flexible enough to meet organizations' needs? So it isn't a black box. So we're not trying to say it's one true platform to rule them all. We're trying to say you as an organization, you need to build your platform. You need to actually orchestrate this stuff together in this middle layer so that it's able to give that cloud-like experience or that like PaaS-like experience, but is actually built the way you want it to be. Yeah. And so that's what we have been trying with our software is called Kratix, and that's what we've been trying, open source. We've been trying to work with customers to understand how to glue these things together, how to give kind of that experience to their developers, but customized for their own business needs.
Yeah, that's always like such a tricky fine balance, right? It's like the whole having your cake and eat it too. I want my developers to be hyper productive, and I want the software that they're putting out in front of our customers to be bulletproof, reliable, and secure. Oh, but I also want it to do all the things that are specific to my organization.
Exactly. I mean, there's someone who I quote a lot, called Mathieu from Nesto, and he talks about golden paths, not golden cages, which I love, right? Because there's a lot of talk about golden paths or paved roads or like making it easy for developers to like get their ideas out to production. Great. but it should be easy to do the right thing, but not impossible to kind of go off-road and do the things that maybe in one particular case you need to tweak this thing, or you need to add this extra special kind of condition for this type of feature of your software. And being able to have golden paths that make 80% of use cases work, brilliant. But being able to have the flexibility to actually break it apart, have some things that are kind of off-road, that's what you also need, because you can't, there's not even one organization where complete standardization is possible. There are always going to be edge cases, and it needs to be possible to cater for those, but in as smooth a way as possible.
Yeah. It's I think that's being willing to accept that trade-off is part of just those platform economics that I think folks sometimes struggle with, is that there's the panacea approach doesn't really exist, but you're probably better off trying to solve for 80% and then get as much lift as you can on everything else. So okay, that's helpful to just sort of think about that, the platform gap as you described. And it's like, I'm curious, as I mentioned, like we've got upcoming our virtual, I forget what we're calling it, like a virtual roundtable, virtual meetup around the PagerDuty plugin for Backstage. But that's another one that, like, Backstage seems like it's sitting at kind of a different level of the equation. It's also like, hey, there's sort of something between an underlying orchestrator type engine and your developers. And there's actually like quite a few things in between. But one of them is part of like, how do you surface the golden paths, not the golden cages? I want to come back also to, you mentioned one of those kind of big, one of the opportunities with platform engineering is aligning to business goals and objectives, and things like uptime and availability can be some of those, like, hey, if this is the top of the list, this is the most important, then that's something that you should align your measurement towards. In the spirit of, okay, PagerDuty, we deal a lot with the sort of the unplanned things, the interruptions, the incidents. I'd love to hear kind of what are your thoughts in terms of how does that, not PagerDuty specifically, but just how does, whether it's the uptime and availability, but resilience, and how you kind of support reliability fit into, platform engineering and even solving the platform gap. Like, how do you think about that?
It's a great question. So we seem to run into lots of customers. You mentioned Backstage. Backstage is a great example of a internal developer portal, right? So we've got a customer who's using Backstage and Cratix together. Great. More than one, but one who just spoke publicly about it. And when we're thinking about talking to customers about what their needs are, what they're trying to set up, I don't know if it's a symptom of the fact that platform engineering is on this kind of hype cycle right now, but we see a lot of people who are like, okay, first thing we need is a shiny new portal. We need something that is easy for developers to get their teeth into. Great. And there's Backstage, there's a few out there. And then we see a lot of, I don't know, platform initiatives which feel like people are trying, or at least looking at, how do we start this journey, right? It's weird for me because I feel like I've been talking about this for so long that surely everyone has got the hang of this by now and knows what they're doing, but that's not the case, right? There's an awful lot of people out there who really are still thinking about what a platform might look like, still trying to understand what to do. And in so many of these conversations, people are focused on day one, right? This is the other interesting thing. It's because in so many of these kind of conversations, it feels like, right, we're going to start, we're going to, pick a portal, and then we're going to figure out how we kind of orchestrate underneath, and then we're going to figure out the golden paths. And then day two is kind of later. But for us, that's not the case at all, right? What we're thinking about, because obviously there's so many security concerns that people have, right? People can't afford to have CVEs taking them down, or like, incidents happening. It's so costly for people that one of the things that we're thinking about a lot is day two experience, how to do maybe some of the SRE measures. So, there's things like trying to reduce toil and SLOs and those kind of things, right? We talk to customers about those as we're, trying to do proof of concepts with the software, for example. Like from the very first conversations, we're trying to talk about that. But the other thing that we think about is when you've got a lot of stuff running, I've mentioned Kubernetes a couple of times, right? There goes my camera. When you've got a lot of stuff running, you manage when there's lots of stuff running, there's lots of Kubernetes clusters out there, for example, it's kind of hard to manage that stuff. So if there's a CVE, if there's a patch, if there's an upgrade, and you've suddenly got to roll it out across like thousands of instances of whatever database running across thousands of Kubernetes clusters, right? That kind of stuff is hard. So that's the thing we've been building into Quatix from like day one, right? It's fleet management is what we've been calling it. How to kind of push out updates quickly. And it's the same thing, I think, with, unplanned interruptions. So it's nice when you've got an upgrade and you can plan it. Where when it's, late at night / early morning, and then something happens and you've got to do an urgent update because something's, going wrong. It's one of those things that, because people keep pushing it down the road, it only becomes a really big deal when it's a really big deal. But we are trying, at least in Centassa, we're trying to think about it early. And I think there's lots of platforms that, or portals, or, whatever people have built in-house, where maybe that day two experience is starting to get a bit difficult as it maybe wasn't built in up front. One thing, you mentioned Gartner earlier. I spoke at a panel in KubeCon in Paris a few weeks ago, and one of the when you say things and then people randomly pick them up and then write about them. I said a thing, and then a lovely Gartner analyst kind of wrote it up. But one of the things he picked up on that I'd said, which I was actually quoting from Platform Engineering Day at Paris, was this kind of thing about platforms starting to go stale, or platform decay. Like we're seeing that, like I say, with a lot of focus of people starting this journey, going for a day one experience, rolling out the platform, getting adoption, people using it. And then maybe the platform isn't being kept up to date, or it's difficult to keep up to date, or, there's sprawl happening where people aren't quite sure what's running, right? And suddenly the platform doesn't feel shiny and new. It feels a little bit old and stinky. And then there's a question of, if something were to happen, if there's an incident, how quickly can you identify it? How do you know where that issue is happening, or this outage is happening? Like, what's the monitoring? Is everything up to date? Is it easy to identify and troubleshoot? Like there's the sort of staleness that's starting to creep in. I think I talked about the trough of disillusionment after this kind of peak hike.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is around people who maybe haven't fully fleshed out day two whilst they've been building day one.
I think you're describing what it smells like in the trough of disillusionment. And you mentioned a stinky platform that's, has a few unaccounted for appendages, and
things rotting in a cupboard somewhere.
Yeah, and some of that it's interesting. So much of what you describe, like it's some of the same things that you would hope from your actual customer facing product teams, and the hygiene that they should be applying. Hygiene and stinkiness, we're really just circling the drain on the vibes here. But that's to what we were talking about earlier with the platform as product. It's like those same things apply, even though the customers are your internal developers. And if it starts to get stale and stinky, then you're going to lose your customers. And then from a business perspective, like, what does that mean, right? Your developers start to, instead of like the golden path being where they want to be for 80% with a little bit of off-road, this sounds like you go back to the days of snowflake machines,
Yeah.
and just the chaos, the very expensive chaos that
Yeah,
ensues.
yeah.
Um, are you seeing like folks kind of wrapping their heads around that ownership at the platform level? I mean, we talk sometimes here about kind of the notion of service ownership, right? And
Mhm.
hey, if you're building a service for a customer, it's the checkout service, it's the, payment transfer service, you are accountable for that. Now, it might be built on top of a platform that a platform team owns everything up to, a certain level of API. And, you're really on the hook for everything above that, right? The code that you have written. And, one thing that gets you really accountable to that code is if you're the person who's getting paged in when something's gone wrong. And, obviously we want to make that experience yeah, as seamless as possible. But um, that idea of full service ownership, I'm just thinking now about kind of full platform ownership, where does the team exist and are they accountable for the platform in the way that keeps it from getting stale and stinky? You're getting a shout out also. I'll see if I can pull this up, uh, for articulating the
Aw,
empathy. So,
thanks, Ben.
um, but yeah, just is that idea, does that resonate with you at all? I'm just sort of bringing words together here of full platform ownership.
I mean, I've got two examples of where I've seen other people talking about it, right, in different ways. So I'm a big fan of team topologies. I don't know if you've read that book. Um, I'm biased because I'm also a team topologies advocate. But I mean, I was an avid fan of the book before I became an advocate. But one thing they talk about is thinnest viable platform, which is
Mm,
distinctly different from minimum viable platform. Minimum viable platform is like just enough platform to get you started.
right.
Right? Thinnest viable platform is actually making sure that it's trying to reduce the problem of platform bloat, let's
Yeah.
say. It's about your platform shouldn't be a never-ending game of stacking more and more things on top of it. It shouldn't be a thing that starts off simple and then gets more and more and more complicated. There should be a goal of keeping it as thin as possible so that it's not like I say, sprawling and bloating forever and ever, that it stays fresh. It offers just enough platform for the teams, and that it's not. Um, Another person I've seen talking about that is Gregor Hopper. He's
Mhm.
just released a book actually like last week called Platform Strategy, and he talks about floating platform, sinking platform,
Mm,
and his message is about your platform should be in a similar way to the way team topologies talk about it. It should be kind of always floating so that as new technology comes in, right? AI, take that as a good example. As new AI-based tools and technologies kind of coming in, and we can get great benefits from it. Your platform needs to be adaptable enough. It needs to float on top of kind of a lot of the technology that are its components, so that it's always kind of floating, not sinking. Right? It should
mm,
always be fresh. It should always make the most of those new technologies. What you don't want is to have your platform so brittle and static that it's kind of stuck with a certain tech stack and that it can't bring in the new greater thing, which didn't say like all the new shiny things, but like whatever are the great new like evolutions in tech, the platform should float and just have those things kind of being able to swap in and keep it going.
yeah.
So I've seen lots of experts talking about it. In practice, both of those things are hard, right? Again, it really comes down to that platform team and can they like do they have that mindset? Are they focused on that aspect of keeping their platform going, but also keeping it as simple as possible? I mean, some do, some don't, right? Depends on platform maturity, I would say.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, and that distinction between like the minimum viable product and the thinnest viable product, that, minimum viable product is almost like meant to just be a starting place,
Yeah,
and it's just about getting started. Whereas just hearing you kind of walk through, I've heard thinnest viable platform, but I think what's unlocking for me now is that it's not that that's just how you start, that is how you
absolutely.
stay as thin as possible. And that's
It's
I
sort
think
of
that's
just
something that,
enough platform. That's the thing
yeah,
I always think about. Just enough.
right. And it is like sort of figuring out when to retire products or
Yeah,
programs. As someone who's kind of
sure.
worked in and around marketing, that's the thing. You get maybe not platform bloat, but you get program bloat,
Yeah.
and suddenly you're trying to support way too much. Figuring out when and how to wind those down to be focused on what's actually needed right now, for our business and for our users and customers. Like that is a much more of like a management skill than any kind of technical
Yeah.
decision. But then you pair that with what you described, where there's also the decision criteria of how are you able to incorporate new technology. So you mentioned AI. I would love to just hear a little bit about, how are you seeing that come into, I wasn't planning to ask this, but hey, it's the Unplanned show, so I'm at liberty to ask unplanned questions. Um, how are you seeing AI kind of come in and show up as, a concern or an opportunity for platform teams and platform orchestration, bringing that into either how the teams are operating or how they're trying to support what their users, developers are building with?
I mean, we've seen it in a couple of places, and I feel like you can't really have a panel or a discussion really without mentioning AI. So,
No, no, it's not allowed.
sorry, it's like bingo, right? I've just like said the buzzword bingo. But I mean, we've seen a couple of cases. So we've been trying it out internally, right? I feel like it's one of those things that it's fun to try. And for our team, we've been looking at what the abstraction that we use on our software is called a promise, right? So
Mhm.
you, as a platform team, you promise something to application teams. You promise them a database as a service. You promise them CI/CD as a service. Like we call our kind of abstraction a promise. And we've been playing around with AI to be like, hey, I wonder if it's possible to kind of like take all the components that we have in a promise, which is basically kind of a Kubernetes CRD and some pipelines and some kind of other bits and bobs. Could we get AI to write promises? So you could take any software and then you could take a set of prompts and then out comes a promise that you could then plug into your Quetix platform. Sort of like it's it's possible. We've been just experimenting with it, but it's maybe I don't know how good they are, but we've managed to create a couple, right? So that's quite fun. We've got a customer who's got their end customers. They're kind of providing, I guess, platform as a sort of a managed service, and they have customers who are wanting kind of AI products available for them to experiment with. So they're looking at running that as a service on top of their platform, offering it to their developers. Developers then get a kind of an AI or like a large language model like on their platform, kind of on their development environment. So they get that kind of available as a service. So I mean, the short answer is there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of noise about AI, and it's hard to identify the signal from the noise, let's say. But I think ultimately, I think even people who are the most skeptical about it would probably recognize that AI is coming. It's not going to go away, and it does have the opportunity as a tool like any other to really speed up developers, to help developers, right? We've seen it with even things like Copilot, like it can really speed up some of the boilerplate kind of code, some of the like toil, like it can really help. And so that's one of those things that if you're a platform team and you're not thinking about it and you're scared because you don't see any way your platform could like bring in any new kind of tool, that's going back to the stinky platforms, that's maybe a smell that you might want to have a look at, right?
Mm. Well, I mean, that seems like a great place to leave off for folks on. smells to avoid, which is ignoring AI, even though that from what you're describing, and other conversations, like figuring out like what problem are you actually trying to solve, and coming from a place of where this has demonstrated value is speeding up developers, accelerating a process. It's maybe not fully taking the humans out of the decision making, but it can really help with iteration and ideation and drafting things faster. And so that is of value. But yeah, honing in on what is the problem you're trying to solve. Any kind of parting final thoughts you want to share with the audience today and on later consumption?
One thing I maybe would like to give a shout out for is the platform maturity model. So I don't know if you've taken a look at that, but it was published last year now. I think it was published just in time for KubeCon Chicago. Yeah, so that would be like end of last year. It's basically a maturity model, which people love them or hate them, but it is what it is. Right? It's a maturity model which looks at 4 different aspects or five different aspects, 5 rows and 4 columns. And it's not supposed to be a checkbox for like, oh, I now need to do this thing. I need to do this thing. I need to get to like level 4 on all the aspects. It's not that. It's supposed to be a way that you can check against the kind of this like maturity model whereabouts your platform sits, and then you can figure out how you might improve, right? And everyone's improvement isn't the same, but you as a platform team, depending on what your organization cares about, depending on the skills on your team and what you're aiming for, then you can use the model as a way of trying to identify how to improve. And it's honestly, I mean, again, I'm a bit a bit biased because the work has been led by one of my teammates, but honestly, it's been a collaboration of like loads and loads of people in the CNCF platforms working group. So it started off as kind of a basic draft that actually Sintasso put together, but it has evolved into something that is actually really, really powerful.
I think I got the right one here. It's the
That's the one.
yep.
Exactly right. Thank you.
CNCF. Yeah. So for folks to grab, just dropped it in the chat. Yes, I have come across that one, and I like the way you're framing of how to use it. Right, it's not check boxes, but you can identify areas to improve. And so that's I think that's a great resource to call out for folks. And thank you, like, just for your time and sharing your wisdom and even venturing off into AI questions.
Not my area of expertise for sure, but you gotta mention it these days.
Yeah, it's and I think everything you said there was like makes a lot of sense and is actually a good point about like bringing it back to platform. I don't know what the freshness. I was like, what's the opposite of stale? Oh, fresh, obviously. Platform freshness, which now it's like this makes me want to write copy like for Irish Spring or something. But it's software, not soap. Oh man, soap is another acronym in software that's been used too many times. Well, on that note, before I just get completely wildly off script, there was no script. Thank you again. Have a good night. Thanks to everyone for joining. I'll make sure I've got the links that were shared in the chat and bring them over to our friends over in LinkedIn who don't seem to get my links. And have a wonderful, uneventful rest of your day.
Thanks, Dormain. It's lovely to see you.
Good to see you too. Take care.